I appreciate you taking the time, first of all, to speak with me
Yeah.
today.
Yeah.
It's an honor and a privilege
Thank you.
to get to speak with you, Denise,
Yeah.
as always. But um, I think it would be really interesting, like given your area of expertise,
Yeah.
specifically around all the experiences you've had, with Johnson and Johnson and
Yeah.
clinical trials and things of that sort.
Yeah.
Um, to start just kind of like with the fundamental
Oh, yeah.
topic, which
Oh, yeah.
is, um, I think, clinical trial design,
Yeah.
right? And the best practices for that
Yeah.
across some of the early stages, of like a pre-FDA
Yeah.
process. So
Yeah.
that would be super helpful if you don't mind touching on that.
Yeah. Clinical trials is something that I think a lot of people have an idea of what they think it is, but because it's kind of still in this like cloudy space, people don't really understand what's the whole function of it. So clinical trials are really just a way to prove if that device or therapeutic actually works. Is it safe to use? And what are the outcomes that come out of it? And so, when you think about designing your clinical trial, you have to think about, am I targeting the right patient? Is this the right thing for them? Are there any safety issues that I need to be made aware of, that the patient needs to be made aware of? And if it's safe enough and effective, now I can move it into the market. So if you're answering all those questions in the right sequence, you usually will have a really nice data package to prove that, hey, to the FDA, that this works, or to any other regulatory body outside of the US to say, we know that this device works, we know that it's safe, and here's what comes out of it. And I think that is where, when you think about how do you present that to a patient to say, why do you want to participate? That's where I think we fail both in medtech and in pharma, because we have not done a great job in helping patients to understand that you're not just a guinea pig, but you're also proving a proof of principle that this is actually the right way to move forward. And I think, unfortunately, we haven't gotten it to a part in the future where you can actually have AI to do all this for you, where you have enough data to say, if we run this through a model, what happens? So we're still at a point where we have to go through and do animal models, for therapeutics, and for med devices, you have to do this with humans. We're not at that point of being able to move beyond that. But with clinical trials, the basic fundamentals is that you are trying to show that, one, does it work? Is it safe? And this is what the outcomes are, in the simplest way to put it.
Um, let's deconstruct that a little
Yeah.
bit. First, starting off with how to prove that your medical device is safe.
Oh, yeah.
Best practices, pitfalls, things of that sort. How do you ensure that you're doing that the right way?
Yeah, safety is a big thing because you don't want to have it where your device is causing any type of issues for the patient. So when you think about the type of material that your device is made of, could that be a problem, right? Is it going to break down in the patient, for if it's going to be for long-term use? If the type of material that's being used, is it going to cause any type of reaction in a patient? So for a while, when we think about hip and knee joint replacement, some of the materials that were being used, like if you think about some of the plastics, long-term, the body was sitting there breaking it down. So now their function becomes compromised. That's not good. Or if you think about some metals, especially when you're thinking about, I think it was cobalt, there's causing cobalt poisoning in patients.
Yeah.
That alone can cause problems for other parts of the body. So, but you wouldn't know that until it gets put into a patient and you start to see, okay, are we starting to see some side effects with this in short term and the long term? And that's where you start to really pay attention to the safety. Or if it's a machine that is self-guided, what type of training do you have to give the person to be able to do that? Or if it's a machine, are they going in with the right amount of pressure? Are they coming in the right space? These type of things you have to look at for different types of devices to understand what is that safety profile of that device. And it makes it easier when you're trying to think about all the possible ways that this could go wrong. And if you're building upon a previously approved device, you already have the foundation of what this device could look like. What are some of the issues that arose from that? What did it get approved for? To say, hey, we're just expanding on the use case in this way, or we tweak these things that will allow us to do these types of things. So that's where you're really paying attention to what's been before you. What are you trying to test for now? And thinking about the future, laying the groundwork for any future device that you may do or for others in the space. But that safety piece is going to be very important to understand who's ever using it. Is it going to cause a problem for them?
Okay, excellent. And then take me through the next step then.
And so when you're thinking about safety, once you figure that out, the next thing you want to look at is how effective is it? So when you think about any type of device or therapeutic, it's really going to come down to if we said it's going to do X, does it actually do that? Right? That's the easiest way to keep it. And you have to think about when we're measuring efficacy or effectiveness, what does that actually mean? That's the biggest piece because you may think from a clinical perspective that this may be, the effective, meter that we want to use, but it may very well differ from a patient's perspective. So this is where you're thinking about effectiveness, FDA is going to be looking for certain things based off of the fact if you're building upon from a previous type of device or if it's something new. Here's what we're looking at within this space. This is what we typically would want to look for. But you're also going to have to somehow also incorporate from the patient's perspective, what are they looking for as well? What I've heard from a lot of patients is there's always this idea of clinical representation, like clinical endpoints. So from a doctor's perspective, this was the most effective. But for a patient, it may not be that, right? So you think about, again, thinking about hip and knee joint replacement, right? Along the lines of, well, hey, it worked. If we replace the joint, the leg is working, right? There may be some pain, but hey, that's something that can be adjusted with or have a person take pain meds or something along those lines. For the patient, having to still take some type of additional medication may not be something that they think is effective. Sure, you replaced my hip, but now I have something else that I have to worry about. And so when I look at some of these companies that are looking at, they may not be a device per se, but it could be we're helping you to kind of redesign your implants so that it works for that patient. Having something like that to say that now we're reducing, issues with surgeries, we're reducing, the ability for scarring, we're reducing the pain that may come with it afterwards. Those are things that patients really care for on top of the clinical piece that you replace their hip. So it's like things like that where you're thinking about the effectiveness of a particular trial. You have to say to yourself, what are we trying to show that we're actually fixing? Are we doing that? And are there any side effects or issues that may arise for the patient? And it always will build upon the safety profile of that particular device as well.
That's very interesting because it seems like from a safety standpoint, the, I guess, risk profile and the potential ways that something can fail from a safety standpoint are pretty finite, right? Because it's kind of contained to what are the inputs of the device, right? To a certain extent. But then when it comes to effectiveness or efficacy, it seems like many, many orders of magnitude more ways that something can fail in terms of effectiveness or efficacy. And so I'm curious, and if you know, great. If not, no worries. But I'm wondering, I guess, how common is it or how difficult is it to truly prove that efficacy, not only from the FDA standpoint, but from a patient standpoint, like you said, clinically, and getting the buy-in from all the stakeholders as a result. And then how do you think about that from a design standpoint in the clinical trial to kind of get ahead of that issue arising later down the line?
See, that's where there's so many variables because we're human. So each person can be doing something and have a different reaction or a different type of, pathway, when you have this type of devices being used. It just depends on the human. And unfortunately, we are not at a point where we can say definitively with enough data, if you took the two of us and we both went for the same type of device, if we would have the same outcome. Or even for a therapeutic, will we have the same outcome? We don't know. We haven't gotten to that point. We can guess, right? There could be some, hints at it, but we haven't had enough data over time to really be able to look at humans and say definitively, if you're like this with these characteristics, this is what's going to happen. This is why clinical trials are important because you're trying to build that data set. But the problem is when you're thinking about the costs associated with clinical trials, trying to find the right location and implement that trial and get these patients in, it's very expensive. So when you're trying to get a representative patient cohort, it can slow you down because you're like, I got to find the right, site, find the right doctor, find the right patient, and then convince them to want to be in a trial. That variability of human nature is what really makes this quite difficult. And so I think the biggest thing is where you're thinking about truly testing and demonstrating effectiveness, you have to plan as much as you can for those variables. And it makes it very difficult because clinical trials are, they're basically just a huge experiment. But you can't say that to a patient because then they're like, "Why are you using me as a guinea pig?" And so it comes down to, have you pulled in the right stakeholders to point out the design flaws? And that's where, before you even conduct a clinical trial, having that advisory board of patients, of key opinion leaders or KOLs, the physicians that are going to be using this device, who may be implanting this device, are important to be at the table with you. And even talking to sites, and their staff who are going to be, kind of recruiting for the trial, to tell you, does this design even make sense? Having that type of advisory board can save you so much time, because now you're starting to understand what's the burden on that physician who's conducting the trial. What is that burden on the patient who's going to be basically the person getting this device put into them or used on them, and understanding the staff that's going to be responsible for taking care of that patient. Having all of their input and showing them, here's the design of the trial, here are the inclusion-exclusion criteria, what do you think? Can save you so much time, because now you're understanding from the key stakeholders who are going to be involved on where do you see the areas that really are going to have a problem. And if you're showing, when you present your design to the FDA, we've talked to all of these people here. So we've thought about the design to be very patient-centric to prove safety, efficacy, outcomes. Then now you're showing the FDA evidence that you thought this through. Because when you're going in and trying to be too lean, they'll look at this and go, I see what you're trying to do to save money, but you're missing all of these things here. So the more you actually think about the design, validate it with the right stakeholders, you now can save yourself time and money and get the type of trial that you need. But it also is a way for you to kind of pressure test, what type of representative patient cohort can you have with the budget that you're thinking about. But you do need to bring in those stakeholders to really be able to address some of those issues. So
Absolutely.
it's important for that. It takes time. And I think that's the part that scares a lot of founders, because they're like, well, speed. Investors are telling me I got to move quick, right? I can't take too much time. But you rather get it right than to speed through and have it where that failed, because then you're going to have to repeat that whole trial all over again. So take your time in the beginning, get the right stakeholders, design it properly, talk to your FDA representative and get their pick on it. Have a conversation with them, right? We talked about this at the LSI panel. Talk to the FDA. I mean, right now it's a little bit difficult.
a lot of changes.
A lot of changes. A lot of people are gone. But I think that if you do still have that connection, talk to them so that they can give you the guidance that you need, right? And that way you can design that trial properly to be able to answer and address all the questions that are needed to get that approval that you're looking for.
Absolutely. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking about representation,
Oh, yeah.
right? Because you mentioned that several times, representation within these trials.
Yeah.
And when I think about some of the types of trials and stages of trials that are required, we're talking 10 and 20 people in a study.
Yes.
We're talking 100 people in a study.
Yeah.
Statistically, I think it's quite the challenge
Very much
to
so.
be representative in that type of design, within that type of constraint.
Yeah.
And so would love to understand how founders can ensure that they have a reasonable amount of diversity within their population across various different types of factors and variables, to ensure that the study that they're conducting is relatively or reasonably representative of their target population.
Yeah. So when you say target population, I've seen some think about it as, well, could it represent just the society that we're in? If we look at census data, like, you could do that, but is that actually the patient population that you're trying to go for?
Right.
So some will look at, like, if you're thinking about it in therapeutics prevalence in med devices, okay, well, what does that patient demographic look like? So if you're looking at, like I said, hip and knee joint replacement, what does that actually look like? Of course, it's going to be an older generation typically, but then you're also looking at across different demographics. So male, female representation. If you're looking at race and ethnicity, right? Thinking about those type of things on what does that representative model look like? And I think the biggest thing is understanding that you can come through all kinds of data that you want, but you also have to keep in mind that that data still may be kind of spotty, right? So when you're talking to your key opinion leaders, you can ask them, well, what does your patient population actually look like? Because they're the ones that are on the front lines dealing with the patients that can tell you, well, this is what it looks like in my area. Because you could look at different cities. And I'll give an example in Michigan. Detroit, it's mostly Black, but if you go out to Ann Arbor, it's mostly white and Asians, right? So depending on who you're talking to, that patient cohort can look vastly different. And that's where you have to think about if we're conducting trials in certain cities, right, or in certain countries, what does that population look like? Talk to the doctors, talk to the physicians that are there to understand what does that representation look like and model it based off of that. Now, it can be difficult because when you think about where you're going to have your sites, that could also differ, can determine what type of patients are going to be pulled into that study.
Yes,
So,
that's what I was wondering
right.
actually, because for example, if someone's conducting a study in Colombia or some other European country,
Yeah.
um, there are cultural factors that affect the patient population
Yeah.
there. At a biological level, causes changes based on different types of lifestyle choices and inputs, et cetera. And so to do a study, for example, in Latin America or Europe and find the correct patient population that can be representative of a device or some sort of implant that would be utilized within, U.S. patients.
Yeah.
Is there a challenge there as well? And if so, how do you kind of address that?
Yeah, there can be challenges because, like you said, lifestyle, right? There could be differences of what what is actually available for the patients there as well, right? Like, is this something that's really new for them? So, like, there's nothing to kind of base it off on. Like, you're like, hey, we know that there's a need there, but maybe they may not have had the same type of opportunities like we had here in the U.S. for options, right? So, how does that impact? I think the other thing too is what is the culture of clinical trials? Is it something that's receptive in that space or not? And I think a lot of people think that, oh, well, if you're going to Colombia, Peru, or if you're going to, Korea or going to Thailand or Malaysia, that it won't have the same level of data quality or the receptiveness of wanting to participate in a clinical trial, which is quite obviously not true. These countries are actually really ramping up their research programs across the board in both medtech and pharma. And I also think, too, that just because we're here in the U.S. doesn't mean that these type of conditions and needs for these devices aren't going to show up in other countries. So the real question comes down to who are you partnering with in those areas? Have they, how are they communicating to their patients about clinical trials? And if they're so involved in the community, maybe you should partner with them because they're the ones who are going to be able to convince the patients to want to participate in this. They're also the ones who would know what's happening in those spaces to tell you, here's the type of patient that we have down here that you could compare back to your major market, which will probably be the U.S. Now, the FDA typically wants you to have representation if you're talking about U.S. data. It needs to be in the U.S. And of course, on a global scale, if you're talking about selling this in other markets, they would like for you to have representation from other areas. But again, and there's been this talk and there's been huge conversations about can you leverage data from other countries to kind of elevate your program and your data? And so there's been some debate on that. But, again, showing that you're thinking about or trying to at least have that type of representation is, I think, the selling point of it. Because you can say in the U.S. we had this type of representation and we've used these different types of countries to supplement. And I think that's enough to say that you're supplementing it and not saying that's what the whole program is based off of. But it is interesting to see cultural nuances and understanding how is it being presented to patients in that country. And at the same time, what are their regulatory rules that you have to follow? Because some countries will say, you can conduct a trial here, but are you going to launch that device here as well?
Yeah.
Because there have been issues in the past where clinical trials are being conducted in countries that were cheaper, but they never, launched that device or that therapeutic in that country. So countries are now saying, if you're going to be using us, you need to now have that type of showmanship that you're going to actually kind of use that device or have that therapeutic in this country as well. Because you don't want to have it where you're kind of taking and not giving back. So that's something else to think about as well is when you're thinking about conducting global studies, where are you going to launch this, right? are you going to use that data to kind of inform the patients that are in that area or in that country that, hey, you were included and here's the data that comes out of it? That sells better and resonates better with patients than you trying to use data from someone else, because patients do ask the question, is this going to work for me? That always comes up. How do you know it's going to work for someone like me?
Absolutely. Do you foresee any challenges given the geopolitical environment right now and how that affects founders and companies who are trying to conduct overseas clinical trials?
I think it will, unfortunately. But I still think that there's still a need. The medical need is still there. And I do think that showing that you're understanding of that and that you're treading lightly is going to be a big thing to pay attention to. Even here in the US, if you exclude external, just in the US alone, how are you going to be communicating this with patients? And beyond just doing a trial, when you get out onto the market, how are you going to be communicating this to patients, right? Are you going to be excluding them? Like you use them in the trial, but you're not talking to them afterwards? That really won't set well, right? Or if you didn't include them in a trial and you're trying to sell to them, how is that going to look? So it's going to be, even within our country, with all of the pools that are happening, especially when you think about the pitting of race and ethnicity, DEI that's happening in this space, how are you going to be communicating this to say why you were shooting to have this type of representation? It needs to always be tied back into business, right? We as a country in 2020 really pushed heavy when it came to DEI, right? Everybody was doing all these things to kind of show that they're allies, that they really cared. But now as time has gone on, we're not seeing that same push. Everything's being challenged. Things are being taken to court. So companies are kind of pulling back. But I think the biggest thing is if you're showing that the reason why you've had this type of representation in your trials is because these are the patients that are in desperate need of this, right? This is where the market resides, and I need to prove that it's effective for them. That is tying it back into business and not just on this moral objective or moral need to say that, hey, it's the right thing to do. So I think for all founders, I would really push them to say, don't just lean into it because you need to. It is, what is the business case for that? What's the value that it's going to add to your company to help you? Because if, at the end of the day, if it's about the patient, to improve that and say, I need to represent the patient because this is what that patient population looks like.
That's really interesting because it seems reasonable that one would approach it in such a way.
You'd think.
You would think.
Yeah.
What is it that prevents someone from approaching it that way? Because like I said, it seems like for example, if my patient population for my particular device or implant is diverse in nature, it has a share of people from respective ethnicities, it has a mix of gender, or just a combination of the sex, right? It's not all male, not all female, but a mix of both. It seems to make sense that you would want to have data on those populations. So in your experience, how do you understand and process situations where the trial design decides not to move in that direction?
The reason being is because in the past, it really wasn't required, right? Think about it. In clinical trials back in 1993, that's when it became a requirement for women to be included in a clinical trial. 1993, right?
That's incredible to me.
Right? So you have to think about the fact that prior to that, you didn't really need to prove that it worked in women, right? So when you think about the fact that now you're saying just recently that you have to have a certain representation of different race and ethnicities in your trial, this is something that's brand new. If you look back through data from a long time ago, you'll see that a lot of it was very much heavily white male. So when you think about how these devices are working, how the therapeutics are working, it's completely based off of this unicorn patient, right? Like, yes, white men do exist, but they're not the majority, right? So now you have to start to have this major shift, but it wasn't a requirement. So this is why a lot of these things were getting pushed through. And when you start to have to incorporate or include these groups, now you have to do extra work. Now you have to explain to them, why is it important? Why are they important? What is their value? And what is their data going to, kind of inform? That's a lot more of a heavy lift than you just going into, a doctor's office and saying, hey, I'll take this white guy because I know he'll come in with no problem, right? But now there's a lot of extra work that has to go with it. So now these trials are going to take a little bit longer because now you have to do convincing. You have to demonstrate credibility. You have to demonstrate the trust in the system that the patient's not going to get screwed over, and then pulling them through. And then what happens is now when you have these more representative populations, these trials are looking at this and going, oh, this actually doesn't work. So now you're having to kind of adjust and pivot. And that is causing, you can see and hear how they talk about clinical trials that 90% of them don't make it because they can't recruit the patient, or you look at the data and you're like, it's not good. So now we're starting to see this enrichment of data that's changing how the industry is performing and what they're looking at as far as the next device, the next diagnostics, the next, digital, tool. And using that to kind of understand, well, what did we get wrong all these years? And why are we just finding it out about it now? And now we're requiring that. But you have to do the groundwork before you can get into it. So if you were not looking at that group before, and now you have to, they're going to be like, well, you got to start from the beginning. You can't just come in halfway with us. You have to explain to us why I should even be a part of it. Why does that impact me? Because when you think about certain types of conditions or diseases, we still don't understand how prevalent they are in other groups. And so, and even like certain conditions where you think about with the bones, with, just thinking about, your arteries, your veins, like what's going on with those type of things. When you're implanting a stent, what does that actually look like, right? Are there certain types of anatomy structures that we really haven't taken into consideration, right? Those type of things, I think, are truly important that we as a society have not really filled in all the gaps across different groups to really be able to say definitively what's going to happen. So when you thinking about how do you get representation into a trial, you need to be baking into that trial design, how am I going to raise awareness and educate them and empower them to want to be a part of this trial and prove to them that they're going to be in the best state of care during this trial. And even afterwards, how they're still going to be able to get the care that they need after the trial is done. That's the part there.
It seems that founders are trying to balance this super strong desire and objective to get their product approved by the FDA.
Yep.
And the added benefit of data from diverse populations within their clinical trials.
Yeah.
And it's walking that kind of fine line between the two, trying to find the sweet spot where it's maximum returns on that investment, adding that additional effort and time to the clinical trial, while enhancing some sort of business case that is present after the product is subsequently approved.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, from your perspective, what's the best way for founders to think about the value of diverse data within these clinical trials and balancing the time and cost elements or factors within that decision?
I mean, it all comes down to planning, right? The biggest thing for me is if you want to make sure that you can sell to the customer, you need to prove that it works. Consumer sectors get that all the time, right? They know if they look at who's consuming their product, that's who they need to market to, but you need to prove that it works for them. It's the same way in any other sector. You need to think about who your end user is and show that it works for them. So my biggest thing is if you want to be able to prove that there's a market fit to the actual market itself, you need to include that into your trial design. And this is why I was saying having the right advisory board, the right stakeholders to give you guidance, but also partnering with the right vendors. There's tons of vendors out there that can help you find the patient that you're looking for who have had great success, right? You usually will hear about CROs. There's a few issues that can come up with that, especially when you're thinking about what that contracting structure can look like. What are going to be the triggers? What are going to be some of the, things that you're going to pull, levers you're going to pull to say if we're not hitting these targets, what happens? What's all within the cost? Because sometimes it could be hidden fees. But I think the biggest thing is partnering with the right type of vendor is going to make a world of difference. Yes, it is an investment, but an investment gives you a complete data package that goes to the FDA to prove that, hey, we thought of all the things we could. This is what the data says to get you that approval and to have the marketing information that you need to prove that, hey, this works for you. This is what this means, right? This is how effective it was for people like you. That is the piece that I think a lot of people fail to realize. It's not just getting the approval for the FDA to say, it's okay, cool. You included a diverse group. Congratulations. It's also the fact that you can use that same data to sell to the end user to say that, hey, we included you. This is how it works for you. That is a piece I think that we never hear about in that pull through because we're always just thinking about, or you're representing the population. But what are you going to use that data for besides just the FDA? That's the piece that I think that a lot of founders don't get because so many people are focused just on that. Oh, it takes time and costs money just to get the FDA to say, yes, it is approved. That's the other part beyond that approval that I think is just as important as to why you need to do that. So if you don't want the FDA to come back to you and say, you don't have enough representation, so you don't get the approval, or if you do, but you're not able to kind of sell the idea to the end user, then that gives you more than enough reason and rationale to go ahead and do that type of representation from the beginning. But be smart about who you partner with, where you're doing your trial, and how does that design actually relate to the real world? Those three things are going to be the most important piece to help you to walk that fine line the right way.
So as a founder now, we've designed for safety.
Yep.
We've designed for efficacy.
Yes.
Talk to me a little bit about outcomes now as the third and final piece to all of it.
Yeah, outcomes is a big deal because a lot of times we think about primary endpoints. That's going to be, did it work? And when you say that it worked, what does that actually mean? And what I've noticed a lot of times with clinical trials is that they're so focused on that clinical outcome that when it comes to what the patient really cares about, you really don't see that. So you'll see a lot of these like primary and secondary endpoints that are being put in there, which is great because you're trying to get all the data that you can get. But what does that actually mean for the patient? Because the more data that you collect, the more stuff the patient will probably have to do, whether it's samples, whether it's different types of tests, imaging, scans. What is that doing for your patient? And if you're not proving that the outcome serves them in a way to kind of reduce their pain, to kind of eliminate a problem, in a way that doesn't give them too much of a burden, then what's the point, right? The FDA is going to be looking at it from a clinical perspective, but they're starting to now look at, well, what are the other patient-reported outcomes that are important for this? So, and again, demonstrating that and getting that type of data at that time of what the outcomes are from that patient's perspective is, again, something that can be used in marketing. Those type of things are the selling points to help patients to understand why they should choose your device, why a physician would even recommend using that device. Because the physicians are going to be your main salesman, right? You're going to have your team go out, sell them this device. They're going to look at it and go, well, there's tons of others like that. Why should I pick yours? And you're proving that this is what it's going to do to help their patients, right? That's the part there that I think you need to really think about when you think about these outcomes. How are you helping the physician and the patient who's going to be using this device to say, hey, I'm making your life better and this is how I'm doing it. So that's a part there when it comes to outcomes you really need to think about is, yeah, you may be filling in a need, but that need needs to be translated in a way for that end user to understand why it's important for them. So I think that's the part there, especially when you think about all these like stents that are out there, where they're talking about implants and things along those lines. It's like there can be a large market where there's tons of them that are on the market. So what's so different about yours? Why is it that I should care to use it? Is it because I have, a reduced chance of having a secondary surgery afterwards? Does it reduce my chances of having further clots down the road? Things along those lines, right? Am I having to worry about having this thing removed because it's causing issues for me, right? Think about all the hernia meshes that are out there, right? And you're thinking about that this is being implanted in people. And yes, it served a purpose by preventing hernias from coming out. And having a reoccurrence, but now they're having to deal with secondary issues of, erosion, migration, things along those lines that's causing nerve pain or nerve entrapment. These are things that it's like, are you able to kind of prevent these type of things from happening down the road for a patient? That's what needs to come out of it, right? That's the piece that I think is the most important when you're thinking about these types of things.
Absolutely. And when it comes to the work you're doing at Impactful Ventures now,
Yeah.
which you founded a little over or
Yeah.
almost a year ago.
Yeah. Coming up on a year.
Yeah, that's amazing. Coming out of Johnson and Johnson,
Yeah.
it's an amazing accomplishment.
Yeah.
Super proud of you for that. Um, how does the work you do with Impactful Ventures
Yeah.
help founders address these three main areas of concern when it comes to clinical trial?
Yeah. I think the thing that helps me out a lot when I think about this, when I'm engaging with founders, is I understand their struggles, right? I've been on the side of being in the industries that they're looking at, and I understand what those larger guys are looking for. So when you're trying to partner with them, what do you need to say to get them to want to partner with you? Where you're thinking about patients, what is it that a patient really cares about that you need to be speaking to and addressing? Those are the things that I've had in my experience over the years. And then even a part of understanding just basic research. My background, I have a PhD. So I've been to grad school, I've had to develop experiments, I had to do all these type of things. So I understand that basic science part as well. So when you're having a conversation with a technical person at a company, where you're talking to the business person or the commercial person, I can speak all of those different languages with them and understand how they all come together. So for me, when I'm working with founders, I am able to have that conversation with them and their executive team to say, here's how you guys should be moving forward. And it's not just on the idea of representation, but I'm helping founders with their business strategy, with their messaging. How do we do that in the most effective way that's going to put you in the prime position? And because of the network that I've built up over the years in different sectors, I'm able to, introduce founders to all kinds of opportunities. So, the biggest thing is you may be in med device, but maybe there could be something that your, device could be used in the pharma space and you've never even thought of it. But because I've worked in that space of pharma, because I've worked on that side of clinical trials, I may be able to help you pitch why your device could be used in that way to help pharma and the therapeutics collect, different types of outcomes and things along those lines. So it's really the idea of how am I able to kind of help founders navigate the space properly, help them to kind of redefine their business strategy, their offerings, things along those lines. If they have data, could you use that to create another revenue stream in addition to your device? Because there's tons of companies out there now who are collecting all kinds of data, with their devices. And so that alone could be another revenue model for you that you didn't even really think of. Could you collect this information and sell it back to the industry? People love to pay for data. So it's thinking in that way with founders, but being founder friendly and not having to charge them too much because I know how you have to be lean. But you're getting that industry experience from someone who understands what it means. And in addition to that, helping you find partnerships and even be helping you to kind of find ways of speaking to investors to help them to understand why it would be, a good investment for them. So all the areas that a founder is really looking for support in, I can help them with that, whether it's through me or through my network.
Absolutely.
So
Thank you so much for sharing that, Denise, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
yeah,
Again, I'm thrilled to see what you're doing with Impactful Ventures,
yeah,
and I appreciate you taking the time to educate us and provide some of these best practices for some of the early stage founders out there who
yeah,
could really utilize this information.
yeah,
And again, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.